The Learning Sea.
Mickey's Christmas Carol.
Make sure you subscribe the channel. It's free for you, but a motivation for us.
One Christmas Eve long ago, the townsfolk of London hurried home through the snow carrying gifts. But not Ebenezer Scrooge. He ignored the pretty snow and gaily decorated houses. He rushed past a group of carolers, muttering, "Bah, humbug!" And when they asked him for a coin to feed the poor, he replied, "If the poor want to be rich, let them work as hard as I do." In his office, his assistant, Bob Cratchit, was hard at work. But then he realized that it was so cold in the office, the ink for his quill had frozen. Surely, Cratchit thought, Mr. Scrooge won't miss just one piece of coal. But just as Cratchit opened the furnace to add the coal, Scrooge burst through the door. "Caught you," he barked. "That coal costs a pretty penny, you know, and you just used a piece last week. Now get back to work." While Cratchit went back to his papers, old Scrooge sat down at his desk and began to lovingly polish, weigh, and stack his gold coins. Then Scrooge's nephew Fred came by to see them. "You're still working on Christmas Eve?" Fred asked. "Bah, humbug!" Scrooge snorted. "We never close." "Mean that Christmas is a humbug, Uncle," replied Fred. "Please come dine with us tomorrow." But Scrooge answered, "Never! I'm a year older and no richer. I have no reason to be merry." And then, saying that there was still work to be done, Scrooge kicked Fred out of his office. It was finally time for Cratchit to go home, but Scrooge wouldn't let him leave until exactly 7 o'clock. "And I suppose you'll want tomorrow off, too?" Scrooge snapped. "Very well, but mind that you come in even earlier the day after." "Thank you, Mr. Scrooge," Cratchit cried, running out the door. "Merry Christmas!" Up the office and headed home. But when he got to his door, he saw that his door knocker had changed into the face of his old business partner, Jacob Marley. "Scrooge!" the knocker called. Frightened, Scrooge yanked open the door and ran for the stairs. Behind him, he heard the sound of chains clanking, and he flew up the stairs 3 at a time. Scrooge ran into his bedroom and slammed the door, locking it behind him. He heard the clanking and dragging sounds getting closer and closer. And then a ghost appeared in the room, wrapped in chains and dragging several heavy objects. "Jacob Marley," the ghost declared, "and these burdens I bear, heavier than all the treasure in the world, are my miserable deeds. They are chained to me forever. I have come to warn you. Change your ways, or you are doomed to be like me." "You will be visited tonight by 3 spirits," the ghost continued. "Listen to them well, for only they can save you now." Then the ghost of Jacob Marley disappeared. Scrooge was determined to ignore what he had seen. He quickly got ready for bed and pulled the covers right up to his nose. But just as he was finally ready to fall asleep, a little figure appeared from the shadows, wearing a top hat and carrying an umbrella. "I am the ghost of Christmas past," the figure told Scrooge. Because the figure was so small, Scrooge just laughed at him. "Silence," ordered the spirit. "You must come with me. Catch hold of my coattails, and we will travel to a time when Christmas was not a humbug." Scrooge hesitated, but he remembered Marley's warning and took hold of the spirit's coat. The window flew open, and Scrooge and the spirit of Christmas past soared through the night and over the rooftops. They stopped at a brightly lit house. When Scrooge looked inside, he couldn't believe his eyes. It was Isabel, the girl he'd once loved, happily dancing with someone. "Who is that?" he asked. "That man was you, Scrooge," said the spirit, "in the days when you were kind and cheerful." Then the spirit whisked Scrooge away again. In the next window Scrooge peered through, he saw himself, many years past. He sat behind a desk covered in money, scowling at a crying Isabel. Scrooge remembered how he had taken Isabel's home from her when she could not pay her bills. "Your greed drove her away," said the spirit. "You were to marry, but you loved only money." "No," Scrooge moaned. "I loved Isabel. I cannot bear these memories. Take me home." Suddenly, Scrooge was once more in his bed. That must have been just a bad dream, he decided. But the thought of what he had done to Isabel still made him terribly sad. Then a hand fell on his shoulder, and Scrooge looked up to see a giant beside his bed, feasting on a mountain of food. "I am the ghost of Christmas present," boomed the giant. "Spare me!" cried Scrooge. "Take my treasure, just don't hurt me." "Keep your treasure, Scrooge," the spirit replied. "Money cannot buy happiness, and only my generosity can save you now. I can give you life, but what have you ever given? Let us take a look." And with that, the spirit scooped up Scrooge, pushed open the roof, and stepped outside. He tore a street lamp from the ground to light their way through the city. Soon they arrived at a tiny, run-down house. "Only a miserable beggar could live in such a dreadful place," Scrooge said. But when he looked inside, "Why, it's Bob Cratchit!" he exclaimed. The spirit scowled. "Look how he lives, thanks to you. Look at the food his family must eat on Christmas Eve because it's all they can afford." The Cratchits sat around their table, ready to carve up the smallest goose Scrooge had ever seen. Then a small boy hobbled into the room, leaning on a crutch. "Who is that boy?" Scrooge asked. "That is Tiny Tim," replied the spirit. "He will soon be one less mouth for the family to feed. He is very sick and must have good food every day to make him well." Scrooge watched Tiny Tim take a joyful bite of goose, and suddenly the scene shifted. It was later in time, and the Cratchits were crying, except for Tiny Tim, who was gone. As Scrooge started to ask where the boy was, he heard the church bells toll, and he knew that poor Tiny Tim had died. Scrooge stepped back from the window to see that the spirit of Christmas present had disappeared, and a smoky haze hung in the air. "Help!" he cried into the smoke. "Don't leave me here!" The smoke grew thicker and flew up his nose, and he sneezed so hard that he went flying through the air, landing with a thud on a pile of snow. As the smoke cleared, Scrooge realized he was now in a graveyard, and he was no longer alone. A horrible specter stood before him. "I am the ghost of Christmas yet to come," the spirit bellowed. "Who are you looking for in this lonely place?" "Please, sir," begged Scrooge, "help me find Tiny Tim." The spirit pointed, and Scrooge saw the Cratchits gathered around a tombstone. Bob Cratchit laid Tiny Tim's crutch on the grave, tears rolling down his face. Scrooge felt awful and wanted to tell the Cratchits how sorry he was. But then the church bells began to toll once more. Scrooge looked around to see another grave gaping right in front of him. "Whose lonely grave is this?" he asked. "Why, Ebenezer," laughed the spirit. "It's yours." And with that, the spirit pushed Scrooge into the open grave. "Please," Scrooge cried, "tell me these events can yet be changed. I will change. Let me out." And then another bell tolled, and Scrooge opened his eyes and shouted with joy. He was in his own bed. Scrooge jumped up and ran to the window. The church bells were ringing because it was Christmas morning. But if it's just Christmas morning, Scrooge thought, then what the spirit showed me last night has not yet happened. Tiny Tim is alive. There's not a moment to lose. He threw on his hat and coat and ran outside. "Merry Christmas!" a group of carolers called. "And a Merry Christmas to you," replied Scrooge, pushing gold coins into their hands as he hurried by. Raced down the road, he saw Fred approaching in a wagon. "Merry Christmas, Fred," he called to his surprised nephew. "I can't stop now, but I'll be there for dinner. Don't forget the chestnuts." After a few quick stops, Scrooge arrived at the Cratchits with a large sack and knocked sharply on their door. Just before it opened, he arranged his face into a fierce scowl. Bob Cratchit answered the door and stammered, "Why, Mr. Scrooge, what are you doing here?" "As you're not working," Scrooge declared, "I've brought you my dirty laundry to wash. See that it's done today." "Surely not on Christmas Day, Mr. Scrooge," Mrs. Cratchit pleaded. Just then, Tiny Tim walked by the door and called out to his father, "Oh, look! Is that a teddy bear in the bag?" Sure enough, there was a teddy bear poking its head out. Scrooge, still scowling at Bob Cratchit, swung the large sack around and threw it on the floor. The sack fell open and the children's faces lit up as brightly wrapped parcels came tumbling out. Scrooge laughed as Bob and Mrs. Cratchit stared in astonishment. Under the presents were the makings of a huge Christmas dinner. "Merry Christmas to you all," chuckled Scrooge. "And especially to you, Tiny Tim." The whole family danced with joy. Seeing their smiling faces, Scrooge promised himself that the Cratchits would never be poor again, and Tiny Tim wouldn't go hungry and would grow stronger every day. "How good it is to be generous and kind," Scrooge said happily. "God bless us, every one," said Tiny Tim. The end.